at 6 days to Passover, when Jesus arrived in Bethany and lodged at the house of Lazarus, Martha, and Mary. We're going to explore why Bethany was important, and we're going to do that by looking at events that led up to this time. So let's begin. And firstly, we're going to look at the Hebrew calendar, because it's important to understand the times that these things took place. The Hebrew calendar begins in spring, in the month called Nisan, also known as Aviv. And this was the beginning of months. John's Gospel in chapter 10, Jesus came to Hanukkah. In the English Bible, it's called the Feast of Dedication. It was winter time. It was celebrated on the 25th of Kislev. And they tried to stone Jesus at Hanukkah because he identified himself as the great I am. Rather than be stoned at this time because his hour had not yet come, Jesus and his disciples retreated out of Jerusalem and went across the Jordan River to the other side. And they stayed there for a while in Bethany beyond the Jordan. Now it is my thinking that Jesus and the disciples stayed in Bethany beyond the Jordan really for most of the rest of the winter. In ancient times, it wasn't normal for people to travel during winter. The heat would come off by staying in a remote place, away from the Jewish authorities, away from the place he was just about to be stoned. Let's take a closer look at the calendar, and we'll look at some of the immediate events leading up to Jesus' arrival with his disciples in Bethany. Now it's while in Bethany beyond the Jordan that Jesus gets word that Lazarus has died. Now he stays a few extra days, but then he and the disciples travel to Bethany near Jerusalem because he's going to raise Lazarus from the dead, which he does, because Jesus is the resurrection and the life. This causes no small stir amongst the authorities. On hearing about this, they convene a council and they plot to put Jesus to death. And they also send out a command that if anyone should know where Jesus is, they should report this to the authorities so that he can be apprehended. Now Jesus, hearing this, retreats again, but this time to a city called Ephraim in the wilderness, where he and his disciples stayed. Now I place this at the very, very beginning of spring, just after the winter months. So this is very likely to be in the month of Adar, which leaves us about a month and a half to Passover that Jesus stayed in the city of Ephraim. This is told to us in John 11 verse 54. Now Jesus no longer could walk openly amongst the Jews, but went away from there, that is Jerusalem, into a region in the wilderness, to a city called Ephraim, and there he stayed with his disciples. It is my belief that when the Bible mentions a town like Ephraim, like Bethany beyond the Jordan, by name, Jesus stayed there for a fair amount of time. Now, I think that he stayed in Ephraim for about a month. It was the immediate place he came from before he went to Jerusalem for the last Passover. Now, twice we've seen that Jesus has retreated. And you might ask, why did he have to retreat? I mean, Jesus didn't do anything wrong. You know, sometimes we can stand up for what's right, and we can do the right thing that way. But it's better to obey the will of God and follow what the Father is saying for us to do than necessarily to stand on the pride of life and exert our rights. Because we can be really, really right, and yet we can fail to obey God and fail to do his will, and our life can be cut short because of it. Now, Jesus only did what he saw the Father do. And so he first of all went to Bethany beyond the Jordan, and then he went to Ephraim. This was the Father's will. He was led by the Spirit. He went to these places. And so we can see that sometimes we don't stand and fight, we retreat. We come to the right hour to lay the fight at the feet of the enemy. But sometimes we retreat in order to find out what it is that God wants to do next. Jesus and the disciples stay in Ephraim until they make that final journey to Jerusalem for the last Passover. It is in Ephraim that Jesus has children brought to him, and he lays hands on them. And he teaches the disciples, and particularly about being like children in the kingdom. And also he meets the rich young ruler, who may well have been the ruler of Ephraim. Now this encounter with the rich young ruler is really interesting because it's recounted in both Matthew, Mark and Luke. But it was in Mark 10:17 that it says, and going forth on his journey. So Jesus was leaving the city of Ephraim, and he was actually on his way out of the city when the rich young ruler runs up to him and says to him, what shall I do that I should inherit eternal life? And so we have that encounter as he's departing the city. And then Mark later then goes on and tells us where he's going. And they were on the way going up to Jerusalem. Jesus was going before them. And they were astonished. And those who were following were afraid. And then Jesus took the 12 to him and began to explain to them the things that were about to happen to him. And this was happening on the way to Jerusalem from Ephraim. Why were they astonished? Why were they afraid? Well, just 3 months before, Jesus had almost been stoned. And also, they knew, the word was out, that anyone who should know where he was, they should report him. So if Jesus was seen as to be a criminal, of course, they were now linked to him as associates of a criminal. And this is not really what the disciples had in mind. And they were astonished and they were afraid, but they continued to follow him because the Father had given them to Jesus. Now, Jesus, knowing this, he helps them by talking to them, by telling them what's going to happen. He opens up about that he's going to be killed, he's going to be put on the cross, and he's going to rise from the dead. This was meant to comfort them. I don't know what the kind of effect it had on them, but it was what Jesus was doing out of compassion for them. Because he knew he'd asked the Father that not one of them will be lost. He had that assurance and he had that joy before him as he went to Jerusalem that everything the Father had put into place was going to come to pass. And that included the safety of the disciples. And what can we take from it? Well, if we follow Jesus, it doesn't matter what's happening around us because the Father has us in his hand, he has us in his purposes, and he intends to use us for his glory. And we cannot be lost from his hands because we belong to him. Do you belong to him? When you examine your heart, do you know that you belong to Jesus? Is that witness inside of you? Because you need that witness in you. Because Jesus always speaks to those who are his sheep, the ones he is saving. So make sure you're right with him today. On the 7th of Nisan, Jesus enters Jericho. He enters into the town and there's a great crowd around him, including his disciples. On the way into the town, Bartimaeus cries out, Jesus, Son of David, have mercy on me. Jesus heals Bartimaeus of his blindness. And then he finds Zacchaeus up a tree and says, Zacchaeus, I need to stay in your house tonight. And so he goes and stays in Zacchaeus' house for the night. This man has now become a repentant believer, but he was also a chief tax collector and a very rich man. It's very unlikely that he would have been molested by any of the authorities whilst in Zacchaeus' house. On the next day, which is the 8th of Nisan, he leaves Jericho to ascend. But on the way out of the city, another 2 blind men cry out to him and he heals them too. And the great crowd then travel up the mountain, which is roughly 12 miles, 18 kilometers, and it's a steady ascent into Jerusalem. And then he arrives in Bethany and he's staying at the house of Lazarus, Martha, and Mary. Now it's really key here because Bethany is going to be his home away from Galilee. It's going to be the place where he stays each night while in this place, Jerusalem, until he is betrayed. So why Bethany? Well, let's take a look at that now. Firstly, it says in Acts 1 verse 12 that Bethany was a Sabbath day's journey from Jerusalem. This means it was roughly 2 to 3 kilometers away at most. So it was close. And so it was a good place for Jesus to retreat. Now, secondly, the name Bethany, it is understood to mean either house of affliction or house of the poor. We know from Matthew 26 verse 6 and Mark 14 verse 3 that Jesus stayed and had a meal in the house of Simon the leper, who was in Bethany. A key guy living in Bethany who was a leper, and we have Jesus coming to this place which is known as the house of affliction or house of the poor. Now, this is my conjecture. A colony of those who suffer from Sarat were abiding in Bethany. Leviticus 13 verse 46 says, as long as he has the infection, he remains unclean, which clearly means that this disease could be healed. But he remains unclean while he has the infection, and he must stay outside the camp in his own place. And so Bethany was the perfect place for Jesus to abide in while he was in the enemy territory of Jerusalem, because there is no chance that he would be apprehended while he was in Bethany. Now, while he was in the temple and he was ministering, the crowds would swell around, and Jesus would be protected by these crowds. And in many cases, it says that they did not seize him because they were afraid of the crowd. But at night, the crowd's gone home. Jesus comes to Bethany, and he's safe because the authorities won't come to a place that's unclean. And so Jesus chose Bethany very well. Now, this is of course conjecture, but I believe it has some weight, that this is what Jesus did for very real purposes. And of course, the Father told him to do this. In John 5:19, truly, truly, the Son can do nothing of himself. He only does what he sees the Father doing, and that he does. And so we have the wisdom of Jesus that we can grasp upon. Follow the Father's will, and the Father will have unique ways of keeping you from the grip of the enemy. And you will be able to do great things without fear, without astonishment. And you will do these things in the midst of the enemy. For it does not say that the Lord will set a table before us in the presence of our enemies. How good is that? So, we're at Bethany, and the next video we're going to take up from there. We're going to see what happened in Bethany. A great, great lesson on the devotion that a woman has for her master. We're going to see the Lord being exalted in worship. So look it up.